What happens when a liberal writer gets red-pilled by a powerful TV producer? Harry Kunzru will join us to talk about his new novel, Red Pill. How did the housewife Ursula Kuczynski become Agent Sonya, a powerful Soviet spy? Ben Macintyre will be here to talk about his latest true tale of espionage. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's October 2nd. I'm Pamela Paul. Hari Kunzru joins us now from Brooklyn. His latest novel is called Red Pill. Hari, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, let's start with the title. And I guess for those who have been living in a cave, or at least not entirely online, perhaps some people don't know what it is to be red-pilled, unless maybe they're, Elon Musk or Ivanka Trump. I don't know. Explain.
So the origin of the phrase is in the film The Matrix, where the hero is offered a choice, one of these life-altering choices. He can either take the red pill or the blue pill. And if he takes the blue pill, then everything will stay the same and the world will appear as it has done to him up till then. But if he takes the red pill, then he'll see the truth of things. He'll see the reality behind the apparent reality. And in that movie, it's a terrible dystopia where, people are being essentially sort of enslaved in some kind of nasty giant cyborg machine. But the phrase found its way onto the internet. And initially, it was actually picked up by men's sort of pickup artists, actually, and they kind of talked about learning their techniques as a form of kind of, the light bulb going on and realizing that they could manipulate women using their pickup techniques. But it gradually has become a political phrase, and it's used by the alt-right to talk about the moment when people suddenly start seeing things their way. If you spend too much time on far-right internet forums, as I have done, you'll see people asking each other, are you red-pilled on the JQ? Are you red-pilled on the Jewish question? Which means, are you a Holocaust denier? So this notion of red-pilling has become to mean the scales falling from your eyes about what they see as the liberal consensus, the sort of consensus reality, and the inverted commas realization that the world is run according to the rules as they see it.
So clearly you've been down this rabbit hole, and I'm taking it that you didn't do that for fun, but instead for research. How deep do you have to go to get to those kinds of red-pilled on the JQ questions? And what was it like entering into that world, even if just for research?
I realized quite recently that I've now officially been on the internet for more of my life than I haven't, if you see what I mean. I got an internet connection in the very early 90s. And even then, when there were under 1,000 websites in the world, there was already some kind of extremist political content on there. I mean, I think it was one of the things that I first understood about this place was that it was a way of having a window into all sorts of subcultures, not just political subcultures, everything, fandoms and sexual subcultures and all sorts of things. But I very rapidly developed a sort of, I don't know what you call it, a habit, a sort of tick of spending a little time every so often just looking at posts on some of the extreme right-wing sites. And I wanted to get an understanding of who these people were and, why they hated me so much. I'm exactly the sort of person who in almost every respect, not just sort of racially, but class and my, tendencies towards cosmopolitanism or whatever. I'm very much on the other side of all their thinking. And so just over the years, I've just, in a very light way, kept in touch with that world. But sometime in the mid-2000s, I started spending time on a site called 4chan, which at the time was just a sort of repository mostly for just sort of filthy jokes and just gross out humor. But there was a sort of edge to it that I was appalled and fascinated by. And I could see people were doing a lot of kind of ironic fascist stuff. They were kind of joking around with the aesthetics and the ideas of fascism. And I kind of went away again. It wasn't a very nice place to be, but by the time I kind of wandered back into it, a lot of the irony had fallen away. I mean, there's a particular history behind that, in that actually a lot of quite serious extreme right-wingers had found that this was a place where they could organize and indoctrinate younger people. And so during the kind of run up to the last election, I was on it again quite a bit and trying to track this very, I mean, I would say vibrant new far right culture that exists online now. I mean, that's a real change from how it used to be back in the 90s when I first started looking at it. By then, it was rather sort of tired and these sort of worn out skinhead kind of ideas that weren't very attractive to people. But then more recently, they've discovered jokes and irony and memes and all that kind of thing. And so I became very immersed in it, all the while trying to kind of work out how best to tell another story, to tell a counter story to that story.
Well, what's the counter story?
Well, it would be nice to be able to summarize it. But I mean, one thing I learned was that a kind of literalism and sincerity doesn't fly in that world. The currency is a very kind of nimble, hyper-ironic, very sort of plugged in, wired humor. So, I mean, the most flat-footed thing you can do is try to argue sincerely. But mocking is often a much better way of countering, I found.
Did you do that? Did you try to engage with people?
No, I was mostly lurking, and I still mostly lurk. I don't really get much out of attempting to persuade people that certain historical events did or didn't happen. But, occasionally, of course, I do end up on Twitter or whatever having encounters. But that's definitely the tone that I found is most devastating in an argument.
And did this lurking and these explorations, did that lead directly to the genesis? Was that part of your path to this novel, Red Pill?
It was. It started, I was thinking about surveillance and privacy, first of all. I wanted to write a story that helped me explore what I think is happening to our sense of ourselves in this new pervasive surveillance culture. And I came towards a writer character who had a set of rather sort of comfortable, I would say complacent liberal ideas, and who was finding his sort of sense of himself altered by the fact that he was feeling watched all the time. And then that fused with this other set of ideas about red pilling and about the idea that, in my opinion, there has been a great complacency in the sort of political center about really addressing some of the fringe ideas that have now come into the mainstream. And so I wanted to write about a character who is being challenged, who is in a sense being red-pilled. He thinks at the beginning that he's fully armored. He's a smart, educated guy. But what happens is that he finds he has fewer answers than he thinks to this extremely bleak, violent, dystopian vision of the world.
I mean, it's interesting that he's this complacent, sort of fairly mainstream liberal character, and the book is coming out at a time when a lot of people on the left have been really radicalized and almost not opposed to, but certainly disillusioned with the kind of character your narrator is.
I think that's true, and I think it's an important political development in that we have discovered that people didn't take it seriously. I mean, we wouldn't be where we are now if there had been what you might call a muscular response to the rise of the right and the blandishments of Trumpism. Instead, there was a very, again, to use the word complacent sense that the system would work just fine and it would expel the alien matter from it without anybody really needing to do very much. And that clearly hasn't been true. I mean, we've discovered that much more of our political system depends on norms than we thought, and that once those norms aren't accepted by all the players, then there's not really many levers to pull to kind of regain the control of it. So we're forced into a position now where the fight is much more red in tooth and claw. And that's obviously very uncomfortable for a lot of people who essentially believe that there's a space of debate and that we need a kind of I don't know, think like an ancient Greek agora where both sides debate each other and, the best argument wins through. I mean, we're seeing a landscape that's actually to do with force and to do with who has almost physical power right now. And that's very, very disturbing. And I'm very, very nervous about the immediate future. I mean, I wanted this book to speak to the present moment, but I would quite frankly have liked it to be less topical than it is.
Yeah. Any book that is at all frightening right now suddenly feels like it's been amplified. I mean, this is a book in many ways about paranoia, which is an especially fertile territory for writers and filmmakers. And I was thinking about this before, and this might be a total oversimplification, but it does seem to come in these kind of waves, these 20-year waves. The period I think we most associate with paranoid art is the 70s. But there was also a 90s version and there was a 50s version. And I'm curious to hear about any sort of inspiration, whether it's movies or television or novels.
I mean, I had a very early and sort of deep love for that kind of extremely busy 1970s American fiction, sort of exemplified by people like Thomas Pynchon. My taste for the zany wore off a long time ago, but I'm still a great admirer of, for example, Don DeLillo's ability to speak about what we've come to call the paranoid style in American political life, the sense of forces behind the curtain, the sense that we're not quite grasping the full story. I mean, and that's in full flower right now. And I think there's a conversation to be had about the way that the internet-enabled version of this cycle is much more intense and much more destabilizing than it has felt for a long time. I mean, people I've spoken to who lived through that sort of Nixon moment when, they were discovering things like COINTELPRO describe a sort of sense of consensus reality shifting. But they have also, several people said to me that they feel that right now is more intense. And I think in a funny way, although a novel is a slow and in some ways kind of unfashionable cultural form, it's quite well suited to dealing with this because novels do complexity quite well, much better than, for example, cinema narrative. And novels can kind of split viewpoint and you can kind of iris in and out. You can change scale all the time. You can talk in terms of big systems and then you can go right into the individual. And so for me, trying to capture the feeling of being alive right now with this sense of the ground shifting under our feet, the novel has been quite a good form. And because the individual as a category is kind of in play, like, I mean, there's my central character feels him, he looks inside himself and he doesn't find anything there. And I feel that hollowness and that sort of absence of center is quite a common experience right now. That also is a thing that the novel can do quite well.
Another way to describe this book would be, kind of Gen X midlife crisis, which I don't know if you're having a crisis, but certainly describes where you are demographically. Did you think about this book as a kind of midlife crisis novel?
I did. It's what I did instead of having a midlife crisis was write the book.
Write a book about it. And then you don't have to have one.
Exactly. You're onto my train of thought. I mean, yes. I mean, I'm in my middle age now, and I wanted to write also. I mean, I opened the book with a description of what I think middle age, the realization of being middle-aged means, which is that you understand that there are certain kinds of changes that can't happen now, that you've already made yourself, or your situation is such that it can only change within certain limits. And what that means, I mean, my experience of being young was that I could kind of reinvent myself every so often and maybe leave certain things behind, and that there was always this infinite possibility. I mean, and some people experience that as a crisis. I mean, I'm very fortunate in some ways in that I'm doing the work I love. I have people who love me. And so I'm kind of armored against the worst of that realization. But at the same time, it's happened at a time when the world sort of outside my front door is more uncertain than at any time. I mean, certainly since the days after 9/11, that would be the last time I had this this sense of everything being slightly spongy and uncertain. And in some ways, this feels more pervasive. And I have children, and I worry about their future, and I feel I have a duty to try and protect and kind of advocate for certain things that I think are, ethically correct. But at the same time, a lot of the kind of intellectual currents that I have surfed on over the course of my life, so to speak, against that. And by that, I mean, when I was in my 20s, I was very interested in what people call the post-human, and the idea that there was something kind of coming after our sense of ourselves, and that our ability to kind of transcend certain limits was going to be very, very important. And I still think that's true, but I saw that as a straightforwardly like utopian possibility. The possibility of reinvention, I thought, was very liberating, that you would be free of categories of race and gender and so on. But now it occurs to me that we have a whole discourse, for example, based around human rights. And if you don't believe there is a human, what are the rights attached to? What if there's not a particular dignity to the human subject? In what grounds do we have for making the case that people can't treat each other as raw material? That's a conversation that I think is happening now. I mean, there's a sort of brutal pragmatism to American politics right now. I mean, the ideals are not to the fore, and might is right, and it's a very difficult kind of needle to thread, really, to try and kind of make a case that there should be a certain sort of dignity given to the human and that should impose limits on the kind of politics that we should find acceptable. And at the same time, when all the kind of grounds for thinking that seem to be ebbing away.
I think brutal is a very apt word choice. I want to go back to the title. The novel that you wrote immediately before this was called White Tears. This is called Red Pill. Is there some kind of Krzysztof Kieslowski project going on, and your next book is going to be Blue?
Yes, the next book is called Blue Ruin. And that will kind of complete a very, very loose trilogy, each of which is sort of centered around, I mean, one of the things these books do is they're centered around different art forms. White Tears was about music, and which is something very close to my heart, and Red Pill is about writing, and the next book I want to think quite a lot about visual art and the kind of the contemporary art system. I won't say any more about that, but they're not linked in the sense of having recurrent characters, but I think they're going to be a sort of constellation that will, I hope, add up to more than the sum of the parts.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that when the time comes. In the meantime, I want to just ask one last thing about another project of yours, which is that you now have your own podcast. And I'm curious to hear about that and what that satisfies, or what you're able to do with that maybe you aren't able to do in your journalistic writing and in your fiction.
It's a podcast called Into the Zone, and the kind of conceit of it is that it's as an exploration of grey areas and fuzzy borders. Each episode is roughly conceptualized around a binary opposition, like one of the big sort of oppositions that we use to organize our thinking. So there's public and private, native and migrant, life and death. And then I get to tell stories, essentially, and talk to people and explore in a very narrative way those ideas. If there is a model, I suppose it could be something like the broadcast that Glenn Gould made for Canadian public broadcasting back in the 50s and 60s. There's a program he made called The Idea of North, where he brought all sorts of different kinds of things to bear on thinking about the North. And I like that opportunity with radio to bring in lots of different ways of talking. I do interviews, there's a sort of essayistic element, and we've got wonderful sound design. So, some of it relates quite directly to material that I've, found through fiction writing, or there are stories that I just think are better told as true stories. The thing I've really discovered that's different from writing an essay is the intimacy of the form. You're speaking into people's ears. You're very, very kind of close and personal to them in a way that is not always the case in a written text. And I've come to really enjoy that. I mean, it's an interesting challenge to write as well, because if you're writing for somebody to listen to, there are certain sorts of arguments that you can't hold in your head. There are odd ticks of the writing where you need to repeat names rather than use pronouns, because people need to be kind of reminded who it is you're talking about in a way that, they can't check back in the way that they could check back with a piece of writing. So that's been an enjoyable exploration. We're most of the way through the first season, and I've got many ideas for more shows. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, it won't, I hope, take you entirely away from your fiction.
No, I still think of myself as a novelist first and foremost, and the side hustle is part of contemporary life.
All right. Well, I hope people listen to the podcast, but first read the book. The book is called, again, Red Pill by Hari Kunzru. Hari, such a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Ben Macintyre joins us now from lockdown in Marylebone, London. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Great pleasure.
So the last time you were here on the podcast was to talk about, I guess now 4 books ago, A Spy Among Friends, your great story about Philby and his circle. The new book is quite different. It's about a single spy, and I think your first book about a female spy, Agent Sonya, Moscow's most daring wartime spy. So tell us how you came to write her story.
Well, by accident, as is often the way with these things, I was researching a completely different spy story, which was about an operation launched at the end of the war by the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. Right at the end of the war, and very few people knew about this story, the OSS began recruiting anti-Nazi Germans in London, particularly in North London. People who had been sort of fallen foul of the Nazi regime and were desperate to get back at the fascists. And the Americans' plan was to parachute these people into Berlin in the dying days of the Reich to send back information using a brilliant piece of new technology. And I'd always been fascinated by this story, so I was digging away at it. And it transpired as I was digging that, in fact, these agents were recruited through German organizations in London that were heavily infiltrated by the communists. They were all diehard communists. And what they didn't know was that, in fact, they were also being run by a woman agent. And that woman was Agent Sonya. Her real name was Ursula Kaczynski. But that was the first I'd ever really come across her. And then I spooled back in her story and discovered this astonishing story that takes one from Shanghai in the 1920s and Weimar Germany and through Japanese-occupied Manchuria and Poland on the eve of Nazi invasion and Switzerland, and then to Britain in the end, where, as I say, one of her last acts was to run these spies who the Americans thought were their spies, but actually they were spies for Moscow.
All right, let's go back to her origin story, right? She grows up in a bourgeois, kind of secular Jewish family in Weimar, Berlin. How does she end up a Soviet spy? What was her childhood like?
Her childhood was very comfortable. It was highly literary. She was the child of a very notable German Jewish academic, and her mother was a painter. She grew up in considerable comfort. But she grew up in that chaos between the two wars of the Weimar Republic, when the fascists were on the rise on the extreme right and communism was on the march on the extreme left. And she was one of those who fell into communism, really, because she believed, and I think this was a kind of perfectly respectable thing to believe in the 1920s, that the only people standing up to the Nazis, the only people opposing Hitler, were the communists. And that was a kind of belief she espoused when she was 17 years old, and she never drew back from it. She remained a lifelong anti-fascist communist throughout the whole of communism. I mean, that's in a way what makes her story so remarkable. She was very young when the Bolshevik Revolution took place and very old when the Berlin Wall came down. So her story is the whole sweep of communism, from its kind of pure ideological beginnings to its appalling manifestations during the Stalinist era, to its decay, to its eventual collapse. So she really is, in a way, the story of communism itself.
How did she get started?
Really, what triggered it was, again, fairly accidental. Her husband, a man called Rudy Hamburger, who was not a communist, although she would later convert him, got a job in Shanghai in China, working for the British Municipal Council. And she went out there with him in 1929. And she was already a communist. She discovered that, sort of unknown in Shanghai to many in the West, a brutal spy war was taking place there, in which the nationalist government was trying to destroy the communist underground. It became known as the White Terror, and some 300,000 people were murdered by nationalist operatives during this period. And Ursula was recruited by an extraordinary woman called Agnes Smedley. Now, Agnes Smedley was an American radical novelist, highly successful. She'd written one very, very popular book, but she was also a Soviet spy. She'd been recruited by the Soviet military intelligence in Berlin in the early 20s. And she and Ursula became great friends in Shanghai. And Ursula confided that she was also a communist. And then Agnes passed her on to a man described by Ian Fleming, no less, as the most formidable spy in history, a man called Richard Sorge, who was German by birth, again, a recruit to the Red Army Intelligence Agency, who recruited Ursula as an active underground agent in Shanghai. He also, they had a love affair, and it was really, in a way, the defining love of her life with Richard Sorge, that combination of sort of emotional romance and active underground work. And she began by running a safe house, a place where Sorge could meet with his communist recruits. She then became very swiftly very important to the entire communist organization, holding their arsenal, running their archive, running her own agents. And she proved to be exceptionally good at it, to the point where, in fact, she was then summoned to Moscow for formal training.
And when was this?
This was in 1932 by now. In 1932, she went to Moscow and she enrolled. I mean, it's an extraordinary story, really. I think she was the only woman to be so trained. And she was trained in radio work, really. She was trained how to build shortwave radios, which could then be used to communicate with Moscow. And she was highly trained in all sorts of other aspects of espionage, but she turned out to be a brilliant technician in lots of ways. And she was then redeployed back to China, to Japanese-occupied Manchuria. So the Japanese had invaded that part of China. The communist partisans were vigorously opposing the Japanese invaders. And Ursula was their conduit to Moscow. They were being bankrolled and supported with guns from Moscow. So she set herself up in a little house in Mukden, a city in Manchuria, and began to send back vital information to Moscow. It was the first time that she'd really been active on her own account, opposing what she saw as kind of Japanese fascism.
And how does she make her way eventually back to England, continuing to work as a spy?
It's an astonishing story because, of course, at the same time as being a full-time spy, she's also a full-time mother and a wife. She had 3 children by 3 different men. And one of the wonderful things I've been lucky enough to be able to do with this book is to kind of interrogate her emotional and interior life. And so she moved on from Mukden. She then ended up in Poland on the eve of the Nazi invasion, and then in Switzerland, where she was running a big spy ring inside Nazi Germany. So she was sending agents across the Swiss border into Germany. And at one point, she framed up a sabotage operation to blow up the Zeppelin. And that then morphed into an even more extraordinary plot to assassinate Hitler, because 2 of her agents discovered that Hitler regularly lunched in a place called the Osteria Bavaria. And between them, they framed up a plan to set a bomb at the partition alongside where Hitler would dine whenever he was in Munich. And it could have worked. I mean, of all the plots to assassinate Hitler, it's the one that probably had most chance of succeeding. But it was called off weeks before, just before it was about to go into operation, because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the short-lived pact between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, a non-aggression pact. It didn't last all that long, but it was that unholy alliance between Stalin and Hitler. And Ursula got a message from Moscow saying, cease all operations against Germany immediately. And she was told to stand down. And it was a shattering moment for her because, she had opposed Nazism all her life. And yet here, the people that she was serving were in bed with the devil in her mind. It was one of many crises of conscience that Ursula suffered over the years. But then, subsequent to that, she ended up in Britain. If you'd been to the tiny Cotswold village of Great Rollright, it's in the heart of the Oxfordshire countryside. It's a sweet little hamlet. If you'd been there in 1945, you might have even seen Mrs. Burton with her 3 children and her husband, Len, climbing onto her bicycle. And heading off into the countryside. In fact, Mrs. Burton was now Colonel Ursula Kaczynski of the Red Army. And in the outside toilet at the back of the house, she had built a very powerful radio transmitter with which she was passing the atom secrets back to Moscow, because Ursula had a ring of spies inside the British atomic weapons program. Again, it was a story that's never really been fully told before, because she was actually vital to running a key agent, Klaus Fuchs, who was, and will be known to some of your listeners. Klaus Fuchs was a prodigiously talented physicist, German Jewish physicist, who had ended up working in the British atomic weapons program, the secret program that Britain and America were developing the atomic weapon with at the end of the war, without telling Moscow. And he decided that this was unfair, that Moscow deserved to know what was happening. And Ursula ran him inside the atomic weapons program. And in the course of this, he produced 570 pages of highly detailed documents describing how to build the atomic weapon, how to do it. He eventually transferred to America and ended up in the Manhattan Project, where he continued to supply now the KGB with top level information. But when the Soviets detonated their bomb in 1949, to the horror of the Western world, one of the main reasons for that was Colonel Ursula Kaczynski, Mrs. Burton, living in Great Rollright in the Oxfordshire countryside. So she really did have a really important impact on world affairs, on the course of history.
All right. Amid all that, you just kind of casually dropped in there that she had 3 children by 3 different men. What's the story there?
Ursula's emotional life is utterly fascinating. Her 2 husbands, she recruited into Soviet military intelligence. So they were her sub-agents. But they were the only people who really knew what she was up to. No one else had a clue, including her children, who didn't discover that Ursula had been this extraordinary spy until they were in their middle age. They were middle-aged before they found out. And so Ursula's story, in many ways, is about juggling what she saw as her ideological duty to communism as a spy, with her responsibilities as a mother and a wife and a homemaker and keeping the family life going. So in a way, her story has very modern resonances, I think, particularly for women in modern times who are trying to juggle a kind of work-life balance. The difference, of course, is that in Ursula's case, work was lethal to her. Had she been caught in Japanese occupied Manchuria or China or Switzerland, she would have been murdered. I mean, she would have been in Switzerland, she'd have been deported to Nazi Germany and she would have been killed. So the stakes couldn't be higher. And it is something that troubled her, I think, for most of her life, this struggle to reconcile the 2 sides of her life. And deep into old age, she often wondered whether she had been a good spy, but a bad mother. And that, in a way, is the emotional core of this story.
Do you think she was not a good mother? I mean, and were you able to interview her children?
I was able to interview her children. The 2 surviving sons were alive until very recently. One of them died earlier this year, but I interviewed them a great deal, and they were very moving about this subject. I mean, they felt they loved their mother and they were rather proud of their mother in lots of ways. But I think they also felt that they had been deceived by their mother and that they had lived in a family that was riddled with secrecy. And the older one, a lovely man called Michael Hamburger, who died earlier this year, said to me at one point, he said, "I'm not sure I ever really learned to trust anybody as a result." So there was a human cost to it. Was she a good mother? It's difficult. I mean, we judge her by our modern standards. And also, there is a double standard going on here. That is not a question that we would ask of a brilliant male spy in wartime or in the Cold War. That simply wouldn't be a consideration. But am I personally slightly chilled by the thought that in the end, she might well have put her revolutionary duty, as she saw it, ahead of her children? In fact, I think she would have done. In fact, at one point she wrote, "I will never abandon my children," and then there's a pause, "unless I am required to take up arms for the partisan struggle." So I think she would, in the end, have put the revolution first. And to me, in modern times, that's a chilling thought, that somebody could be so dedicated to a cause like that they would be prepared to sacrifice their children. But it's a very difficult question. We celebrate the heroes of the French resistance who opposed Nazi during the Nazi occupation of France. But what we often forget is that many of those opposing Nazi occupation were communists. In fact, the backbone of the resistance to Nazism were communists. And they were also putting their families at risk. They knew that if they were caught, their families would be wiped out. And we celebrate them as heroes. But in Ursula's case, it is more nuanced, and it is this is not a one-dimensional picture of a sort of heroine woman spy with your brilliant reviewer put a small pistol in her handbag. She's much more interesting and much more complicated than that.
And she was not the only woman spy at the time, but there was still presumably a lot of sexism in the field of espionage and in the circles in which she was operating. In what ways did that work against her?
There are obviously women spies in history from Mata Hari onwards, but they tend to be agents. They tend to be people recruited, often by men, to perform specific intelligence tasks. Ursula is different in the sense that she was a trained intelligence officer. She was a pro. And she rose very, very high in the ranks of the Soviet intelligence service. And I have not come across a single woman in any intelligence service at the same time as she was alive who managed to do the same thing. So she is exceptional in that way. And yet, you're right, it was an extremely sort of chauvinist, male-dominated world. She kept having these children, but there was no maternity leave from Soviet military intelligence. They were not geared to women. On the other hand, her gender served her extremely well. She worked out very early on in her career that being a mother, being a wife, being a housewife, baking scones in Great Rollright was the perfect cover. That the Chinese, the Japanese, the Nazis, the British intelligence, they simply couldn't see her because she was a woman. And there are these MI5 did eventually realize that somebody was transmitting from Great Rollright. I mean, they started to look around and they began zeroing in, but they were focused almost entirely on her husband, Len. They didn't see Ursula. And there are these extraordinary, with hindsight, really quite amusing entries in the MI5, the FBI equivalent, the MI5 security service files, in which they say, and I paraphrase, well, it really can't be Mrs. Burton because she's so busy bringing up her children. I mean, it was as simple as that, the disguise.
So she was constantly underestimated.
Constantly underestimated, as so many women were, but she managed to turn that brilliantly to her advantage. Interestingly, though, the only person in MI5 who really spotted Ursula, who realized that something was going on here, was a woman. She was the only woman in the Soviet section of MI5, and she went by the unimprovable name of Millicent Baggott. And she was an unmarried, highly formidable anti-communist expert. She was the model, in fact, for Connie Sachs in the John le Carré fiction, because David Cornwell, the real name of John le Carré, knew her well in the 60s in MI5. She was the only person who spotted Ursula. And she didn't have proof, but she was constantly urging her male bosses and colleagues to look more deeply into this family. And she was ignored. She was completely ignored. So in a way, it took a woman to find a woman.
She also became, speaking of fiction, a novelist, a best-selling novelist, right? How did she wind up writing books? And what kind of books did she write?
She wrote children's novels, essentially. She went back in East Germany in the latter part of her life. She completely reinvented herself as someone entirely different. She gave up her name, Ursula Kaczynski, and rechristened herself Ruth Werner, and wrote a number of highly successful children's books. In a way, I think it's a brilliant sort of brings the story full circle, because Ursula was always, in lots of ways, a creature of her own imagination. From young girlhood, she'd always written, and she had a vivid imagination. And in her I was lucky enough to read all of her childish writings. She's always the sort of main character in her own drama. So in a way, to return to fiction at the sort of last third of her life, was a kind of coming full circle in a way. And it's an odd thing, but I think there is an interesting sort of connection really between fiction and espionage work. I think it's no accident in a way that some of the greatest writers of the 20th century have also been spies at some point in their lives. Ian Fleming, John le Carré, Somerset Maugham, John Buchan. Graham Greene, they were all involved in intelligence. And perhaps that is because, in a way, the work of a spy and the work of a novelist are not so very different. What you do is you create a false world, an imaginary world, and you try to lure other people into it. And the better you are at that, the better you are likely to be at espionage. And Ursula was brilliant at it, but it also makes for a very good novelist. And she's been compared to, she was once described as East Germany's answer to Enid Blyton. And she became more famous as a writer than she ever did as a spy.
Maybe a related question. Obviously, people love reading about spies, not just in fiction, but in nonfiction. And you clearly enjoy writing about them because you've written this book, The Spy and the Traitor, Operation Mincemeat, many books about spies during the war and Cold War periods. What do you think appeals to us so much about spies as readers? Why are we so fascinated by these stories?
Well, there are lots of elements to it. I think one is just there is a sort of essential human fantasy about living a double life, about appearing to be one person on the outside and being someone completely different on the inside. And that is a sort of, in a way, it's a sort of universal human trait to imagine ourselves as somebody else. And perhaps that's also, in a way, what fiction does. I love writing about this world because it allows me to explore the kinds of subjects that are usually dominated by fiction. Loyalty, love, adventure, romance, duplicity. These are the things that novelists write about. But if you're lucky enough to, as I have been incredibly lucky in this, to have the sort of the density of material, enough sort of detail, you can tell these stories or try to tell these stories in a way that is a proper narrative. So it kind of moves along like a novel, but is entirely true. Nothing is ever made up. And so I think the spy world lends itself to that sort of narrative nonfiction, while sort of allowing us to explore the sort of hidden recesses, really, of the human heart. There are, these are complicated people, and in some cases very eccentric. In the best cases, they also have a sense of living, as I say, in their own drama. That they are inclined to write very vividly about the world they inhabit.
I asked the same question of Scott Anderson on the podcast recently. Why are people so interested in spies? And he gave basically the same answer, that interest in double lives. So clearly there's something there. I'm tempted to ask you about your double life.
I wish I had one. I don't really. I was very drawn to intelligence from a young age. I mean, I was very briefly recruited by Britain's intelligence service, and I didn't last very long because I demonstrated very quickly what I've just demonstrated to you, which is a chronic inability to keep a secret. So I was a much better as a journalist and a writer than I was as an intelligence person. But it is a fascinating sort of enduring sort of fascination, and particularly as a British writer, British intelligence has a sort of peculiar theatricality to it. I think maybe it doesn't reflect very well on the national character, but to coin a phrase, nobody does it better.
Yes, I think we Americans are all very jealous.
Well, don't be, because, we also ended up, Britain had the worst case of being penetrated by enemy spies of almost any intelligence service in the world, with the Cambridge Five and Kim Philby and Don McLean and so on. So, our fascination cuts both ways. But I think there's a sort of British fascination with the idea of knowing a little bit more than the person standing next to you. Someone once described it as the ruthless exercise of private power. And that, in a way, seems to me to sum up what espionage work really is.
Well, it makes for huge fun for the reader. So thank you for writing these books, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've enjoyed it.
Ben Macintyre's latest book is called Agent Sonya, Moscow's Most Daring Wartime Spy. Alexander Alter joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Alexander.
Hey, Pamela.
What's going on?
So as we talked about last week, we are quickly approaching literary awards season, which is always a really exciting time. We get the Nobel Prize in Literature, the Booker Prize, and the National Book Awards. And this is a great way to drive attention to books that might have been overlooked. not usually by our critics, I'll say, but maybe commercially, maybe they didn't get a ton of attention at the time. And, driving discovery for debut novelists and authors of serious nonfiction that's not of a political nature is especially important this year, I think, because of the way that the pandemic and shutdown have reshaped the market, driving so many book sales online. And independent bookstores are normally the outlets that direct people and readers to those books that are sometimes overlooked by the mass market channels. So this year, of course, everything is weird this year. The entire world is weird, but the awards season is also weird. The Booker Prize moved to November. It's normally in October, putting it much closer to the National Book Awards. And this week, they announced that they were moving again by a couple of days because there's another major literary event occurring right around the same time, and that is the release of former President Barack Obama's memoir, which is going to be a huge deal for booksellers, for readers. There's a 3 million copy first printing, so that's going to put a lot of strain on the printing presses. And so the Booker, which was originally going to be announced on November 17th, is now going to be on November 19th, because November 17th is the day that President Obama's memoir comes out. And the National Book Awards are happening on November 18th. So it's going to be an extremely busy week for our desk, the books desk at the New York Times, and an exciting week for readers. But it's also, it's a little bit of a headache, I think, for not just, people who are covering these prizes and administering them, but for booksellers, because when the winners are announced, particularly for the Booker, but also for the National Book Awards in the fiction and nonfiction category, in the poetry and young people's literature category, it really boosts sales for those books. So that means bookstores are going to be scrambling to get their hands on extra copies. Printers are going to be trying to print them. And in the meantime, likely the biggest book of the year is coming out at the same time. So in a year where kind of the supply chain has been under enormous strain and there have been a lot of logistical headaches, and the market has still performed really better than anyone had expected, this is just throwing another curveball at publishers and authors to see, wow, can we meet the demand? And this is all, of course, happening after an election that, it could be drawn out possibly. There'll be extended coverage of it. It's going to be a massive crunch of what is normally sort of a busy season into just a few days.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you one thing that's not happening that week, which is very sad for us here at the Book Review, which is that this is the first year in its 67 years that we are not going to have the Best Illustrated Awards, which is our annual award and the only award that the New York Times gives for books that goes to the 10 Best Illustrated Children's Books of the year. We have an independent panel of judges who normally convene and spend a full day going over all of the picture books and graphic novels out there, all of the illustrated books for kids, and pick 3 based purely on the art from around the world. It's the only award of its kind. And very, very sadly, we had to cancel it this year for the pandemic. But on our end, it usually makes it an even busier week. The award is done in collaboration with the New York Public Library. And we have a wonderful ceremony where illustrators travel from around the world, from as far away as Australia and China, to accept their awards. And it's a really beautiful, moving ceremony. People take it really seriously. It's a big deal in the world of kidlit, and alas, it's not happening.
Oh, that's disappointing.
I know. I'm very disappointed. So I just needed to talk about it for a moment.
I understand.
You can look forward to next year. There are lots of other prizes out there. They're all happening at once, except for this one.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, it'll be a really interesting, I think, holiday season. So many bookstores basically make up the bulk of their revenue for the entire year in the months leading up to the holidays. And this year, they are begging shoppers and readers to buy early because they're expecting severe shortages at the printers and longer shipping times. And it's really critical for the sort of survival of independence that they have that influx of sales at this time of year. So that's something that I know the whole industry is watching and worried about, but also feeling hopeful about, because even with everything that's going on in the world, it's still an incredible time for publishing. There's so many good books coming out. The finalists for the Booker Prize includes, I think, four of the 6 are debut novelists. And there's a ton of debut authors on the National Book Award long list. So it is still an extremely exciting time to be in the book business. So
order your curbside delivery today.
Exactly.
Is what we're saying.
That's
Get your
right.
books now. All right, Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about the latest in literary criticism, our critics Jennifer Salai and Parl Siegel. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Jen, let's start with you. You've been reviewing a lot of books on the news recently. It's almost hard to keep track of them right now. Books coming out from and around and about the Trump administration. What did you write about this week?
So this week I reviewed a book called Where the Law Ends, and it's by Andrew Weissman, who was one of the top prosecutors on the Mueller investigation. And so, one of the things that makes this book really notable is that at the moment, it's the first insider account from a team that was notoriously leak-proof while the investigation was actually happening. Andrew Weissman decided to write it, he says, in March 2019, when he heard that Bill Barr had released his own 4-page summary of the Mueller report. And, Weissman says that Barr's summary, if you could even call it that, was ultimately a total distortion of what was actually in the report. And so he decided to write this book in order to set the record straight about what actually happened during the investigation. And also to make clear that, at least as he puts it, as Weissman puts it, that the Mueller team did find a lot of evidence that the Trump campaign probably, and the president, I should say, probably obstructed justice, but the report didn't actually come out and say it. They decided to err on the side of showing rather than telling. And, he says that was ultimately a very big mistake.
Okay, I have 18 questions.
Okay.
But let's start with this. What were the most shocking, damning, interesting new things that you found out reading the Weissman book?
The Mueller report itself was 400-some pages. I mean, who knows how many Americans actually read the entire thing. But, the way that Weissman at least justifies it, he says that the thinking behind it was that it was presented as really an internal Department of Justice document, and that it was supposed to be presented to the Attorney General, who was Bill Barr, who became Attorney General a month before March 2019. So it was intended to be presented to him, essentially laying out the evidence of what they found. But because of all the pressure that they were experiencing, a lot of it had to do with Trump constantly tweeting out the notion that he might pardon people if he wanted to, if they decided not to cooperate. And not only that, but also, and this was something that I didn't know, but that they were under the constant pressure. The team was under the constant pressure and apprehension that they were about to be fired at any moment. So, working under those constraints or in that situation, they decided to err on the side of caution. And there was really sort of two factions that Weissman said was present on the Mueller team. And there was sort of the more aggressive faction. And it's clear that Weissman considers himself part of that one. And then there was the more cautious faction that was very worried about pushing the president's buttons. And so they backed off. And, Weissman's conclusion at the end is that he understands that there's a noble institutionalist reason for that. But the implication is that we're at a point where that just doesn't make any sense anymore.
So you reviewed this after reviewing two other books very much, if not about the Mueller investigation specifically, in this vein, the Bob Woodward book, Rage, and White House Inc. I'm curious, again, reading all three of these together, I don't know, what are we learning from books that we aren't learning from the news cycle, if anything?
I think that's the big question, especially now at this point, 4 years into the administration. And this is a president that generates a lot of copy, not just in terms of books, but also in terms of the daily news cycle. I mean, there's always something new to talk about or to react to. And I think, in terms of all these books that have to do with the president, the Weissman book, the sort of balance of new insight and information is actually pretty good. That was impressive to me. I think that, for example, with the Woodward book, I mean, Woodward did have a lot of behind-the-scenes access. He talked to the president, I think it was 17 times at least on the record. And so, in that sense, Woodward did have maybe information in some sense that people didn't have. But I think at this point, what I'm curious about is the question of insight, some sort of sense of perspective about what's actually happening. Because I think at this point, we just have a lot of information. I mean, there's a ton of information. I think the question is, okay, well, what do we make of it?
Do you feel like these books will make a difference in some way?
I don't know. I don't know what will make a difference at this point. I will say that, it's interesting with Weissman because he really focuses on institutional failure. He sort of says, okay, well, Trump is this figure in the book, obviously, but he's just sort of there in the background, tweeting, dangling possible pardons, just doing stuff and saying stuff. But Weissman really looks at the question of why, even if Trump is who he is, why the institutions that are supposed to hold the executive branch to account haven't done it. And I think that is actually a really interesting question. And it sounds like a boring question in a way, because I think that Trump has a way of, just because of the way he is and the way he presents things, just sort of sucking all the air out of the room. I think all the attention goes to him. But I think, the question of institutional failure is actually a pretty enormous one. And I think Weissman tries to deal with that. I don't know if his proposed solutions in the end really make sense at this point, if things are really where he suggests they are. But I think it's an important book for people to think about.
I asked that question, and in a way, it's a totally unfair question, but it's a question that I think a lot of readers have been asking. It's almost like there's an expectation that books somehow, like there's going to be this one book that's like a magic bullet that for opponents of Trump will sort of take him down, will sort of somehow finally expose. And what's interesting is that at least in interviews, Andrew Weissman has said that what he wants to do is sort of straighten the historical record. And Woodward has said, I think, similar things, that their object is not to strike some kind of political blow, but rather to say, this is what happened and I'm taking a step back.
Well, and I think that's also important to keep in mind, because I do think that, with the environment, the political environment being what it is and people being as polarized as they are, that there is a part of the reading public that is yearning for a book that will change everything. But are books necessarily for that? I mean, books have multiple purposes. And yes, I think that there's, one of the very important aspects of some of these books is that they do enter things into the historical record. It is interesting to me with somebody like Woodward, where his most recent book, he comes out right at the end and says that after looking at the evidence, he doesn't think that Trump is the right person for the job. So he's dropping a pretty big conclusion for a journalist to do at the end of a 450-page book. And, Weissman himself also makes his own argument, but I think he is interested in presenting the experience of the people who worked inside a team where there were a lot of people on the outside who sort of speculated about how it worked or had guesses about what happened. But he's saying, this is what I saw, this is what I experienced. And I will also say one of the interesting things that I found about this book is that, this is a sort of a close-up portrait of Mueller that we haven't necessarily seen. And, on the one hand, there's something pretty reverential about it. He presents Mueller as somebody with unfailing integrity who treated the people he worked with with respect and, made it clear to them that their mission was to seek the truth. But then at the same time, he also implies that Mueller was oddly tentative and timid when it came to the parts of his job that Weissman says were important, but that Mueller didn't think necessarily were, which had to do with interfacing with the public, or at least recognizing how some of the work would be made public and how it would be received.
Pearl, did you review a book that's going to tear down the world? What's your book going to do?
I like that our books are paired together on the pod this weekend.
I do too.
Yours is so timely, and mine begins some 500 million years ago, in another turbulent age. I reviewed a book called The Book of Unconformities, Speculations on Lost Time by the anthropologist Hugh Raffles. And I suspect when people read our reviews, there's a feeling that, maybe Jen and Dwight and I, or all reviewers, that we read a book and we come to sort of like a conclusion pretty quickly. But books like this, like the book that I reviewed this week, it's one of the most mysterious books I've ever read. I wrote in my review. It's still haunting me. I kind of wanted 6 more months with it. And it's because it unravels on this huge, huge sense of scale. So, how do I begin to describe it? It's a book about a man, Hugh Raffles, the author, who's grieving the deaths of his 2 sisters who died, months apart in 1994. And after they died, he's assigned to, he studied insects, he studied the Amazon, but he became very interested in rocks, or so he says in this book, as symbols of permanence, as something that could be an anchor. And his book is kind of like the biography of a few strange rocks, and he doesn't use their stories, their histories, as a portal into his own grief. That's not how it works. His grief is the occasion. It sort of gives the book. It sort of focuses the reader's attention more, that we're interested in him because we know that something in him is broken. Something in him is in deep pain. But he's not interested in his pain. He's interested in rocks as sort of these literal manifestations of history, of missing time, of cosmic grief. So each rock becomes a story in many ways of either indigenous history, genocide. It becomes a history of his own family's suffering and loss during the Holocaust. And the density of these sections, I cannot be overstated. You're very lost, and it's not that the writer cannot write clearly or won't tell you and tether you to a narrative. I think for me, as I was reading it, I was like, the reading experience is as much a part of this book as the rocks, as the geological formations that he's interested in. He really wants you to try to put these things together. What is an individual history? What is a collective history? What is the scale of a human life? What is the scale of a human life when it's juxtaposed with, the 500 million year history of the North American crust? It's a really unmooring experience. It was a frustrating experience. It was a very beautiful experience too. But yeah, it's one of those books that, we get to spend like a week with, but I have a feeling I will be going back to this and still trying to understand what he's trying to show and what he was trying to sort of put together.
My cheap 5-second takeaway is that maybe perhaps we shouldn't be as upset as we are about our current political, social, cultural crisis, because in geologic time, it's not going to matter.
I don't know if that's true, though, because one of the most interesting things from the book is that he describes 2 versions of geological history, 2 different sort of camps. There are people that believe that because you're thinking about the Earth's crust, like, okay, so where I'm standing right now, right underneath my feet, is a seam of marble that stretches from Vermont to North Carolina that was formed years and years ago. And if you study this marble, as he does in this book, it intersects with so much indigenous history. It intersects with all the sort of amateur gentlemen scientists who founded geology. It's a complicated history. So how do we explain it? Well, geological history could be something that happens slowly and it accrues. And of course, the scale is too big for us to contemplate. But then there's a school of history that sort of says that no, it's catastrophes that create geological history. It's this volcano going off. It's this sort of plate. It's this asteroid, tumbling into Greenland and that gave us meteoric iron, that set off all these other sort of events. So I don't know. I think that there's so many metaphors for when you do look at geology for trying to understand this time. But I found that part of me, especially because of this moment, really warmed to the catastrophic idea of history. That it's tranquility and it's peace that is the aberration, in the large scheme of things.
Well, I'm glad that my 5-second cheap takeaway is totally wrong and that you were able to find other versions of comfort in the book.
I mean, but look at my version of comfort is also so grim. But what can you do?
All right, let's run down the titles of the books we talked about, starting with you, Jen.
I reviewed Where the Law Ends by Andrew Weissman.
And I reviewed The Book of Unconformity, Speculations on Lost Time by Hugh Raffles.
Carl, Jen, always a pleasure to talk to you, even when, or perhaps especially when, discussing very grim matters.
Thanks, Pamela. Always.
Yes.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.